The chandelier shattered before anyone noticed she was breaking. Lauren Bennett stood in the center of her own ballroom wrapped in emerald silk and silence, while her husband laughed across the room as if she did not exist. 10 years of marriage, and she had never felt more invisible than she did under the glittering lights of their Greenwich estate. The mansion pulsed with wealth that night, crystal glasses chiming like distant bells, the scent of aged bourbon and imported lilies thick in the air. Investors from Manhattan drifted across the marble floors, praising Michael Bennett for another bold acquisition, another ruthless win. He stood tall among them at 42 silver, threading his dark hair, confidence radiating from every polished gesture. When he smiled, the room leaned closer. When Lauren smiled, no one noticed. She had once commanded rooms too. At 24, Lauren Hayes had been the art world's rising spark, her canvases burning with color and rebellion. Critics called her fearless. Galleries called her promising. But promises faded after marriage, after charity luncheons and silent auctions and dinners designed to impress men who measured worth in stock percentages. Somewhere between the 5th gala and the 100th polite laugh, she stopped painting. No one asked why. Margaret Bennett did not bother hiding her disdain. Michael's mother, draped in diamonds, older than Lauren, approached her that evening with a smile sharp enough to wound. "You look tired, dear," she murmured, loud enough for nearby women to hear. "Green is such a difficult color to pull off." The women tittered softly behind manicured hands. Lauren held her glass steady, though her knuckles whitened against the stem. Across the room, Michael did not look her way. He was recounting a story about risk and reward, about buying failing properties and flipping them into gold. His voice was animated, magnetic. He did not see his wife standing alone beneath a portrait of his grandfather. He did not see how her shoulders stiffened each time someone whispered. He did not see her at all. Then Ethan Parker stepped onto the terrace. The doors opened with a rush of cold Connecticut air, and there he was, 35 now, taller, broader, the same thoughtful eyes that once watched her paint until dawn. Ethan had traded campus poetry readings for international photography exhibits, his name printed in magazines that celebrated authenticity. When he saw Lauren, he froze just for a breath. Then he smiled, slow and genuine, as if no time had passed. "Lauren Hayes," he said quietly, using the name she no longer heard. The sound of it struck something deep inside her, something buried under years of Bennett expectations. She felt exposed, as if he could see through the emerald dress, through the practiced composure, straight into the woman who used to dream in color. For the first time that night, she inhaled fully. They stepped onto the terrace where the city lights shimmered below like scattered diamonds. Ethan spoke of Istanbul's sunsets and desert storms he had captured through his lens. He asked about her art, not her husband's portfolio, not her charity work. Her art. Shame flickered across her face when she admitted she had not touched a brush in 6 years. Life, she said softly, though even she heard the hollowness in it. From inside, Michael noticed. He saw his wife laughing, truly. Laughing, her head tilted back in a way he had not witnessed in months. Something tightened in his chest, unfamiliar and unwelcome. He excused himself from his circle irritation, masking something closer to fear. When he reached the terrace, his voice was clipped. "Lauren, we're leaving." The air shifted instantly. Ethan stepped back, hands in his pockets, observing. Lauren looked at her husband, then at the skyline, then back at the man she had married. For a flicker of a second, she imagined saying no. The word trembled on the edge of her tongue, but habit won. It always had. As they drove home through the quiet streets of Greenwich, silence filled the car like smoke. Michael's jaw was tight around unspoken accusations. Lauren stared out the window at the dark water beyond the trees. In the reflection of the glass, she saw not a millionaire's wife, but a woman disappearing in plain sight. And somewhere deep inside her, beneath years of compromise, a spark reignited. She did not know it yet, but that spark would burn everything down. Lauren did not sleep that night. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the climate control system and the steady rhythm of Michael's breathing beside her, calm and unbothered. She lay staring at the ceiling, replaying Ethan's voice in her mind, the way he had said her maiden name as if it still belonged to her. Hayes. The syllable lingered like a memory she had tried too hard to bury. At 7 the next morning, she rose before Michael and stood in the kitchen wrapped in a silk robe that cost more than her first apartment. Sunlight spilled across the marble island, illuminating the sterile perfection of the room. She poured herself coffee and realized something unsettling. Everything in this house was curated, polished, expensive. Everything except her sense of self. That had been neglected for years. Michael came downstairs in a pressed suit, already checking emails on his phone. He kissed the air near her cheek without truly touching her and asked about his schedule for the evening. Lauren answered automatically, her voice steady, her mind elsewhere. He did not notice the distance in her eyes. He did not ask why she seemed different. Within minutes he was gone, the echo of the front door closing far louder than usual. By 10 in the morning, Lauren was seated across from Rachel Morgan in a quiet cafe in Soho. Rachel had known her long before the Bennett name, long before the emerald gowns and charity galas. At 34, Rachel was still fierce, still blunt, still the only person who looked at Lauren without calculation. She studied her friend's face now with concern sharpened by years of loyalty. "You disappeared," Rachel said finally, wrapping both hands around her cup. "Not physically. You're here. But you stopped being you." The words struck deeper than any insult Margaret had ever delivered. Lauren opened her mouth to argue to defend her choices, but the truth hovered heavy in her chest. She had disappeared. She had traded passion for approval, silence for security. They talked for hours, the conversation peeling back layers Lauren had forgotten existed. She admitted she had not painted in 6 years. She admitted she no longer recognized herself in the mirror. Rachel did not offer pity. She offered challenge. "Then stop waiting for permission," she said. "You're not a guest in your own life." The statement settled into Lauren's bones like something solid and unshakable. On the drive back to Greenwich, Lauren did something impulsive. She exited the highway and parked outside an art supply store she had once loved. The bell above the door chimed as she stepped inside, and the scent of oil paint and canvas hit her like a forgotten language. Her fingers brushed over brushes, tubes of color, blank stretched linen waiting to be transformed. For the first time in years, her pulse quickened with something other than obligation. She did not hesitate. She bought everything. Paints in bold, unapologetic shades, wide canvases, charcoal sticks. When the cashier asked if she was starting something new, Lauren paused. "No," she said quietly. "I'm starting again." The words felt dangerous, alive. As she loaded the supplies into her car, she felt both terrified and exhilarated, as if she had just stepped onto a bridge that might collapse beneath her weight. That afternoon, she cleared a forgotten guest room overlooking the garden. She pushed aside storage boxes and golf trophies that symbolized Michael's victories. She set up her easel near the window where natural light spilled across the floor. When she squeezed the first line of crimson onto her palette, her hands trembled. Doubt whispered loudly, "You're rusty. You're irrelevant. You're too late." Then she made the first stroke. The brush dragged across the canvas, hesitant at first, then firmer, more certain. Color bloomed beneath her hand like something long suppressed finally breaking free. Hours passed unnoticed. When Michael returned home earlier than expected, he found her standing before a half-finished painting streaked with paint and breathing hard as if she had run a marathon. He stared at the mess at the canvas, at the unfamiliar fire in her eyes. "What is all this?" he asked, irritation flickering across his face. Lauren did not apologize. She did not soften her tone. "I'm painting. she said simply. The room fell silent. Something had shifted. And for the first time in 10 years, Michael Bennett felt the ground beneath his control begin to move. The change did not arrive like a storm. It began like a quiet rebellion. Lauren woke before sunrise each morning, slipping from bed without disturbing Michael, trading silk robes for worn jeans streaked with color. While the mansion still slept, she painted beneath the pale wash of dawn, her movements deliberate, her breathing steady, as if reclaiming territory inch by inch. Each stroke carved space for a woman who had been silent too long. The canvases multiplied quickly. Some were dark, saturated with shadow, and fractured light portraits of loneliness, disguised as elegance. Others burst with raw color, violent reds colliding with defiant blues, as if her suppressed emotions had finally found language. Lauren did not plan these compositions. She felt them. The brush became an extension of everything she had swallowed over the past decade. Michael noticed the schedule shift first. Breakfasts no longer waited neatly prepared. His calendar was no longer curated by invisible hands. At 42, he was accustomed to control to systems that responded without friction. Lauren had always been part of that system, seamless and dependable. Now she was unpredictable, absent from rooms he assumed she would fill. The inconvenience unsettled him more than he cared to admit. One morning he paused outside the guest room that had become her studio. The door was slightly open, and he watched her through the narrow space. She stood barefoot before a towering canvas hair-loose face streaked with cobalt. She looked nothing like the poised hostess his investors admired. She looked alive. The realization unsettled him in ways he could not articulate. "You've been busy," he said later that evening, attempting casual curiosity as she rinsed brushes at the sink. Lauren glanced at him, not defensive, not seeking approval. "Yes," she replied simply. No elaboration, no invitation for commentary. The brevity of her answer felt like distance. For years, she had explained herself, softened every ambition to avoid discomfort. Now she offered nothing beyond the truth. Her transformation extended beyond the studio. She joined a yoga class in town, trading charity luncheons for early morning stretches and steady breathing exercises. She cut her hair to shoulder length, subtle but decisive, and began choosing clothes that reflected comfort rather than expectation. There were no dramatic declarations, no arguments, just quiet evolution, just forward motion. Michael found himself watching her in public spaces with a new unease. At a dinner party hosted by a hedge fund partner, Lauren engaged in conversation about contemporary art and market instability with effortless intelligence. She challenged a flawed projection without hesitation, her voice calm but firm. A few guests nodded thoughtfully. Michael forced a smile, but inside something tightened. He had underestimated her reach. Margaret noticed as well. During Sunday brunch, she commented sharply on Lauren's bohemian phase, suggesting it would pass. Lauren met her gaze without flinching. "It's not a phase," she said evenly. The table fell silent. Margaret shifted uncomfortably, unused to resistance. For the first time, Lauren did not shrink beneath scrutiny. She held her ground, and that quiet steadiness carried more power than raised voices ever could. Meanwhile, Ethan's name lingered in Michael's thoughts like an unspoken threat. He told himself it was irrational that Lauren's changes had nothing to do with an old college boyfriend. Yet he remembered the way she had laughed on the terrace, unguarded and bright. He had not heard that sound directed at him in years. The memory gnawed at his confidence. Late one night, Michael stood alone in his study reviewing contracts, but the numbers blurred. He thought about the woman painting in the next room, about the way she no longer waited for him to return home. He had built his empire through strategic acquisition by recognizing undervalued assets and transforming them into profit. The irony struck him hard. He had lived beside extraordinary value for 10 years and never truly seen it. Upstairs, Lauren added the final stroke to a new canvas. It depicted a woman standing at the edge of a vast ocean wind, tearing at her dress horizon wide and unclaimed. The figure's face was turned forward, not back. As Lauren stepped away, she felt a clarity she had not known in years. She was no longer asking to be chosen. She was choosing herself. And somewhere in the quiet corridors of their mansion, Michael Bennett began to understand that the woman he thought he possessed was becoming someone he might not be able to keep. Michael Bennett had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without flinching, but the silence at his own dinner table began to unnerve him. It was not loud or dramatic. It was strategic. Lauren no longer filled the space with explanations or reassurances. She ate slowly, spoke only when necessary, and then excused herself to return to the studio before he could redirect the conversation. Control, he realized, was slipping not through confrontation, but through indifference. He attempted charm first. The next evening, he arrived home with a bouquet of white orchids flown in from California, their price high enough to signal effort without apology. He placed them in the kitchen with a measured smile, expecting gratitude to soften the distance. Lauren thanked him politely, her tone warm but detached, as though he were a business acquaintance rather than her husband. The subtlety unsettled him more than anger would have. Margaret noticed the change immediately. During a phone call heavy with implication, she asked Michael whether Lauren was still playing artist. The phrase sharpened into something dismissive. Michael responded defensively, surprising even himself. He did not defend Lauren's talent, but he bristled at the insult as if it were directed at him. Margaret sensed hesitation and pressed harder, warning him that a wife who forgets her place forgets her loyalty. The words lingered long after the call ended. Meanwhile, Lauren reviewed the trust documents alone in the studio, the legal language now familiar and no longer intimidating. The waterfront easement lay quiet and unassuming on a town map, yet she understood its significance with increasing clarity. Without that narrow strip, Michael's redevelopment project stalled. Investors would question timelines. Competitors would circle. She did not relish the leverage, but she respected it. Power, she realized, did not require noise to exist. Michael began noticing the ripple effects. An investor called to inquire about zoning delays, voice clipped with concern. A project manager hinted that access negotiations were slower than anticipated. Michael reassured them confidently, unaware that the final authorization rested not in a distant boardroom, but within his own home. For the first time, uncertainty crept into his otherwise seamless projections, and he despised the feeling. That Friday, he insisted Lauren accompany him to a private dinner with key stakeholders. She agreed without argument, arriving in a simple black dress that emphasized restraint rather than spectacle. Throughout the meal, she listened more than she spoke, but when one executive mentioned anticipated approval for the waterfront access, her eyes flickered with awareness. She said nothing. The silence felt deliberate, almost surgical. Michael noticed the glance. A cold realization edged into his thoughts, vague but persistent. Later that night, he confronted her in the hallway outside the studio. "Is there something I should know about the Hayes property?" he asked, striving for casual authority. Lauren met his gaze evenly. "There are many things you should know about me," she replied, her voice calm, neither threatening nor apologetic. The ambiguity unsettled him deeply. He retreated to his study, pacing beneath shelves of framed awards that once symbolized unquestioned dominance. For the first time, he considered the possibility that he had underestimated his own wife, not because she lacked capability, but because he had never looked for it. The thought bruised his pride. He had built a career on identifying hidden value. How had he failed to see it at home? Lauren returned to her canvas heart steady. She did not intend to sabotage him. She intended to redefine the terms. If he wanted partnership, he would need to acknowledge her agency. If he wanted access, he would need to offer respect. The easement was not revenge. It was evidence. She dipped her brush into deep indigo and drew a bold, vertical line through the center of the canvas, dividing shadow from light. Across town, Margaret arranged another luncheon, unaware that influence was shifting beyond her reach. In New York, Ethan received confirmation of Lauren's tentative interest in a small Chelsea gallery showing. And in Greenwich, Michael stared at the blueprint of his grand development, realizing that the final piece of the puzzle was not land or capital. It was the woman he had treated as background. For the first time in years, fear sharpened his ambition not of losing money, but of losing her entirely. The night of the gallery opening arrived with a quiet tension that neither Lauren nor Michael acknowledged aloud. In a modest Chelsea space framed by exposed brick and warm amber lighting, Lauren stood beside her canvases, 34 years old and newly unafraid, while guests murmured about texture contrast and emotional force without realizing they were witnessing the collapse of a marriage rebuilt in real time. Across the city, in a town that valued reputation above truth, Michael Bennett drove toward Manhattan with the awareness that he was no longer attending as a supportive husband, but as a man hoping not to be replaced. Lauren's collection was unapologetic. One canvas depicted a woman in a glass mansion, her silhouette fractured by reflections she could not escape. Another showed a shoreline split by a single decisive line shadow on one side, fierce color on the other. Viewers leaned in, drawn to the vulnerability threaded through bold strokes. Ethan Parker moved quietly through the room, guiding collectors, deflecting attention from himself and redirecting it toward her. He did not stand too close. He did not need to. His respect was evident in the space he allowed her to occupy. When Michael entered, the air shifted not because of his wealth, but because of the history he carried into the room. Conversation softened. Eyes flicked between husband and artist. He approached her slowly, noticing the way she did not rush to him, did not adjust her posture to accommodate his presence. She greeted him with composed warmth, introducing him to a critic who had just praised her exploration of power and silence. The irony was sharp enough to cut. He studied the largest painting in the room and felt something close to shame. The figure within the mansion was unmistakable, though her face was turned away. He recognized the marble floors, the scale of the windows, the emptiness disguised as luxury. He understood that this was not abstract art. It was testimony. For the first time, he saw himself not as protagonist, but as background and architect of comfort who had neglected connection. A collector inquired about the piece, asking Lauren what inspired it. She answered calmly, speaking of emotional architecture, of how structures can imprison as easily as they protect. Her gaze did not waver. Michael felt exposed, not attacked, but revealed. He wanted to interrupt, to reclaim narrative control, yet he remained silent because the truth was undeniable. The room was not his to command. Ethan approached him, then polite and measured, extending a hand without hostility. "She's extraordinary," he said simply. The words were not a challenge. They were an acknowledgement. Michael searched for defensiveness, but found only clarity. Ethan was not the threat. His own neglect had been. The realization settled heavily in his chest, reshaping years of assumption in a single breath. As the evening progressed, 3 of Lauren's pieces sold, each transaction a quiet affirmation of value she had once buried. Applause rippled softly through the gallery. Michael watched as she signed certificates with steady hands, her signature bold and unhesitating. He understood something crucial in that moment. She did not need his empire to validate her worth. She had constructed her own. Later, when the crowd thinned and the city's noise returned to its steady rhythm, Michael stepped beside her without pretense. "I didn't see you," he admitted quietly, the confession stripped of arrogance. Lauren studied him, searching for calculation and finding only fatigue. "No," she said gently. "You didn't." There was no cruelty in her tone, only fact. Outside, Manhattan glowed against the dark river, restless and alive. Michael felt the fragile edge of something he had never confronted, the possibility of loss, not as punishment, but as consequence. He could not command this room. He could not purchase back time. He could only choose whether to remain the man who dismissed her or become the one who finally stood beside her. Lauren looked at the skyline and felt a different awareness, softer but equally powerful. She had not painted to wound him. She had painted to reclaim herself. Whether he joined her in that reclaimed space would depend not on promises, but on sustained change. As they stood together beneath the city lights, their reflections merging faintly in the gallery window, both understood that the next chapter would not be dictated by wealth or pride. It would be shaped by courage, or it would end. Michael Bennett had always believed that transformation was a strategic move, something executed in calculated stages with controlled risk. But the first time he walked into a therapist's office alone at 42, he realized there was no acquisition model for regret. The waiting room smelled faintly of eucalyptus and quiet judgment, and as he sat beneath framed abstract prints, he understood that this was the first meeting in years where his name held no advantage. He was not the man with the waterfront deal or the influential mother. He was simply a husband who had not noticed his wife disappearing. The therapist asked direct questions without flattery. When had he first felt distance? Why did he equate control with stability? Michael began with defensive answers, polished and rehearsed, but under steady scrutiny, those answers thinned into confession. He admitted he had feared Lauren's independence because independence implied choice, and choice implied the possibility that she might not choose him. Saying it aloud stripped the fear of its sophistication. It was not strategy. It was insecurity. Meanwhile, Lauren felt the shift before she saw evidence of it. Michael returned home earlier not to demand signatures or press timelines, but to sit quietly in the kitchen while she prepared tea. He asked about her latest painting and waited for the answer, instead of interrupting. The difference was subtle, almost fragile, but she noticed it the way one notices a change in wind direction. Caution remained, yet so did curiosity. One evening, he entered the studio without agenda, watching as she layered soft gold over a stormy backdrop. "What does it mean?" he asked, and this time the question carried no challenge. Lauren explained the concept of resilience of light refusing to vanish even when shadow dominates the frame. As she spoke, Michael listened fully, not because he wanted leverage, but because he wanted understanding. The simplicity of that desire startled them both. Margaret attempted to intervene again, her voice sharp over the phone, criticizing Michael's absence from family functions and hinting that Lauren's influence was weakening him. Michael felt the familiar tug of loyalty and expectation, yet he also felt exhaustion. He answered calmly, informing his mother that his marriage was not a boardroom to be managed by committee. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long and offended. When he ended the call, he did not feel victorious. He felt independent. Lauren observed this evolution carefully. She had no interest in replacing one authority with another. What she wanted was partnership. During dinner, she outlined the terms for the trust signature with clarity, linking the waterfront project to a funded community arts center and ensuring that creative space would not be sacrificed for profit alone. Michael did not argue. He asked logistical questions, took notes, and agreed to involve her in ongoing oversight. The conversation felt adult, not adversarial. For the first time in years, they collaborated rather than competed. Contracts were revised. The arts commitment formalized. When Lauren finally signed the authorization, she did so not as a concession, but as a decision aligned with her values. Michael watched her signature form with steady lines and understood that this was not surrender. It was strength, shared by choice. The true turning point arrived quietly on a Sunday afternoon. Michael surprised Lauren by enrolling in a beginner painting class at a local studio, awkward and visibly out of place among younger artists. His brushstrokes were clumsy, his proportions uneven, yet he remained absorbing instruction without ego. Lauren stood at the back of the room, unnoticed at first, watching her husband struggle not with art, but with humility. Something inside her softened. Later that evening, seated on the terrace overlooking the dark water, Michael spoke without performance. He admitted that he had confused providing with loving, that he had hidden behind success because vulnerability felt like exposure. Lauren listened, her own guard lowering in increments. She told him she had built walls not to punish him, but to protect herself from vanishing again. The air between them felt clearer than it had in a decade. The mansion in Greenwich no longer felt like a sealed display case, but a space in transition. Change was not explosive. It was consistent. Michael continued therapy. Lauren prepared for another gallery showing. They argued at times, old habits surfacing, yet apologies followed without delay. The power struggle that had once defined them began to dissolve into something less dramatic but more durable. On a quiet night, weeks later, Lauren stood before a new canvas and realized that the figure she painted no longer faced the ocean alone. There was space beside her, not crowded, not imposed, but available. Downstairs, Michael reviewed development plans that now included a cultural wing named not for the Bennett legacy, but for the Hayes Foundation. He paused before final approval, understanding that this was not a concession to his wife. It was recognition of her equal stake in the life they were rebuilding. 3 months later, the ocean air in Cape Cod felt nothing like Greenwich. It tasted raw, unscripted, almost defiant, and as Lauren stood on the quiet stretch of shoreline, wind tangling her shoulder-length hair, she realized she no longer associated silence with loneliness. Michael had arranged the trip without spectacle. No investors, no press, no orchestrated surprises, just a rented coastal cottage with weathered shingles and wide windows that faced an endless horizon. It was the first time in years he had planned something that did not double as a strategic advantage. The days unfolded slowly. They walked along the shore in the early mornings, sand cool beneath their feet, speaking about small things, first about books, about light, about the way tides reshape everything without asking permission. In the afternoons, Lauren sketched in a leather-bound notebook while Michael read beside her, occasionally glancing up as if reassuring himself she was still there. The absence of performance felt fragile but honest, like learning a language neither of them had practiced in a decade. One evening, as the sun dissolved into streaks of orange and bruised violet, Michael stopped walking and turned toward her with a stillness that carried more weight than any dramatic speech. He did not kneel. He did not plead. He simply said he had been arrogant not because he loved success more than her, but because he feared losing control more than he valued connection. The admission landed without theatrics, stripped of ego, almost quiet. Lauren listened carefully, studying his face the way she studied unfinished paintings, searching for layers beneath the surface. She saw exhaustion there, and effort, and something unfamiliar, but genuine. When she spoke, her voice was steady, not softened by nostalgia. She told him forgiveness was not a single moment, but a series of consistent actions, and if he ever reduced her to an accessory again, she would leave without hesitation. The boundary was clear, unambiguous. Michael nodded without argument. For the first time, he understood that her independence was not rebellion, but insurance, a safeguard against vanishing. He admitted he no longer wanted a dependent wife who needed him for survival. He wanted a partner who chose him freely. The distinction felt monumental. Choice instead of obligation. Respect instead of control. The words hung between them, fragile yet powerful. Back at the cottage later that night, they sat on the wooden deck wrapped in shared silence, waves crashing rhythmically in the distance. Michael spoke of restructuring his schedule, of delegating more responsibilities to his executive team, of stepping back from the constant chase that had defined his identity. Lauren did not respond immediately. She had heard promises before, but this time there were no grand declarations, only practical adjustments and visible follow-through over weeks. By the end of the trip, something had shifted. Not the intoxicating rush of new love, but something steadier, more deliberate. On their final morning, Lauren painted the ocean horizon in quick, decisive strokes, adding a second figure beside the first, not overlapping, not overshadowing, simply present. When Michael saw the addition, he did not comment on composition or symbolism. He only stood quietly behind her, understanding that space beside her was not guaranteed. It was earned daily. As they drove back toward Connecticut, the road stretching long and sunlit ahead, both understood that the hardest part was not forgiveness, but maintenance. Love would not survive on apologies alone. It would require vigilance, humility, and the courage to confront old habits before they calcified again. Yet, for the first time in years, the future did not feel like a performance staged for others. It felt like a choice being made again and again by two people who had nearly lost everything and were now learning how to build without erasing each other. The drive home was quiet but not uncomfortable. Xavier kept one hand wrapped around mine as the city lights blurred past the tinted windows, and I could still feel the warmth of his fingers grounding me. My mind replayed the night again and again, the ripping sound of my dress, the laughter, the cold marble beneath my heels, and then Xavier walking through the door like a storm. Even now, sitting beside him in the back of the car, I felt a mixture of relief and disbelief, as if the entire night had unfolded in someone else's life instead of mine. Xavier studied my face carefully, his expression still tense despite the calm tone he tried to maintain. "You were brave tonight," he said quietly, brushing his thumb across my knuckles. "Stronger than I would have been." I shook my head softly, leaning back against the seat. I wasn't brave. I was just trying to hold on to my dignity. He gave a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Sometimes that's the bravest thing anyone can do." When we reached the penthouse, the elevator opened directly into our living room, warm lights glowing softly against the skyline outside. A garment bag already waited on the sofa, along with fresh flowers Xavier must have ordered while we were driving. He guided me gently toward the bedroom, his touch protective but careful, like he was afraid I might still break. "Go change," he murmured. "I'll have dinner brought up. Something light." I nodded, stepping into the room and finally allowing myself to exhale fully for the first time all night. The rose gold dress he'd ordered fit perfectly, the fabric soft and comforting against my skin. I washed my face, redid my makeup, and when I looked in the mirror again, the woman staring back looked calmer, steadier, and somehow stronger. The humiliation hadn't disappeared, but it no longer defined me. I walked back into the living room where Xavier stood near the window, his silhouette framed by the glittering city. When he turned and saw me, his expression softened instantly, and he crossed the room in 2 quick steps. "You look beautiful," he said quietly, brushing a loose strand of hair behind my ear. I smiled faintly. I looked beautiful before too. He paused, then nodded slowly, understanding the deeper meaning behind my words. "You did?" he replied. "And you still do." The sincerity in his voice wrapped around me like warmth, easing the last of the tension in my chest. Dinner arrived shortly after, simple and quiet, just the two of us at the long dining table that suddenly felt far less formal than usual. We spoke about small things at first, the children at the community center, a new painting I'd been working on, the acquisition Xavier had been negotiating. But beneath the conversation, there was a deeper understanding forming between us, something shaped by what we had both witnessed that night. It wasn't just about humiliation or revenge. It was about the kind of life we had chosen together. After dinner, Xavier led me onto the balcony where the night air felt cool and refreshing against my skin. The city stretched endlessly below us, lights flickering like stars scattered across the ground. He slipped his arm around my shoulders, pulling me gently closer. "You know," he said softly, I almost called off everything tonight. I was furious. I wanted to make them regret every second. I leaned into him, resting my head against his chest. "I know," I whispered, "but I'm glad you didn't go too far." He tilted his head slightly. "You're always the voice of reason." I smiled faintly, watching the traffic far below. Not reason, just perspective. Tonight reminded me why we live the way we do. Why we don't chase attention or status. Because those things attract the wrong kind of people. Xavier nodded slowly, tightening his arm around me. And yet, even without chasing it, it still finds us sometimes. We stood there quietly for a moment, the city humming softly beneath us, and I realized how different everything felt now. The silver gown was gone, ruined beyond repair, but the experience had given me something more valuable than any dress ever could. It had shown me my own strength, my own composure under pressure, and the quiet power of walking away with dignity instead of anger. And as Xavier pressed a gentle kiss against my temple, I understood something else, too. That night hadn't broken me. It had refined me like fire shaping steel, leaving me stronger, steadier, and more certain of who I was. And as the lights of the city shimmered beneath us, I knew that whatever came next, I would face it the same way I had faced tonight, with quiet strength, unwavering dignity, and the knowledge that real power doesn't come from wealth or status, but from the courage to remain kind, even when the world chooses cruelty. Stories like this resonate deeply because they reflect something far more universal than wealth status or revenge. From a psychological perspective, public humiliation often reveals two types of power. External power built on money and influence, and internal power built on self-worth and emotional intelligence. Alexandra's strength did not come from her husband's arrival, but from her composure before he even walked through the door. She chose dignity over retaliation, and that choice reshaped the entire narrative. In leadership and behavioral psychology, this is known as quiet authority, the ability to influence outcomes without raising your voice or seeking dominance. What makes this story meaningful is not the downfall of the bullies, but the reminder that true confidence never needs to prove itself. People who rely on appearance and status often crumble when faced with calm self-assurance. Alexandra didn't just walk away with her dignity. She demonstrated that kindness, restraint, and grace are forms of strength far greater than intimidation. And in the long run, those qualities always leave the deepest impact. If this story resonated with you, consider supporting the channel with a like and subscribe. Not just to follow the story, but to continue exploring powerful lessons about dignity, resilience, and quiet strength. And before you go, drop a short comment below. Quiet power.